notice it when someone opens up carefully. They don't overshare, they don't dramatize. They choose their words slowly, like they're testing the ground. They say something like, "I think I'm struggling," and the response comes back fast. "You'll be fine. You're strong." Everyone goes through that. It sounds supportive, but the conversation ends there. Later, you realize what bothered you wasn't the response. It was how quickly the door closed. You start noticing how often this happens, how vulnerability gets answered with reassurance instead of curiosity, how emotions get acknowledged just long enough to be moved past, how people mean well and still miss each other. You notice it especially when the people involved share culture, same food, same sayings, same faith references, and yet something doesn't translate. You begin to realize that what feels like misunderstanding isn't really about words. It's about what those words are supposed to do. Here's the tension most people never name out loud. People who grew up in Africa and people who grew up in the diaspora often talk about the same things, but they are solving different problems. One is solving for survival, the other is solving for coherence. One is trying to keep life stable, the other is trying to make life make sense. So when one person says, "Don't dwell on it," they're not dismissing emotion, they're protecting momentum. And when another person says, "I need to talk about this," they're not being dramatic, they're trying to integrate experience. Two people can love the same culture, use the same words, and still misunderstand each other because they were shaped by different definitions of safety, success, and belonging. This is where the friction lives, not in values, not in intention, but in what each person believes a conversation is for. To really understand this divide, you have to stop asking what people believe and start asking what they were trained to protect. In many African contexts, life did not reward emotional exposure. It rewarded continuity. You learned early that things could fall apart quickly, that systems were unreliable, that adults carried burdens quietly, not because they didn't feel them, but because stopping wasn't an option. There was no applause for processing your feelings. There was relief when the lights stayed on, when school fees were paid, when food stretched far enough. So you learned something very specific about safety. Safety meant not becoming a problem, not adding weight, not slowing momentum, not making your internal state someone else's responsibility. If you were sad, you endured. If you were confused, you adapted. If you were overwhelmed, you pushed through. This wasn't cruelty, it was calibration. Emotion was real, but containment was wisdom. Now contrast that with many diaspora environments. Here, danger didn't always come from instability. It came from fragmentation. People fell apart quietly. Homes functioned, but individuals drifted. Depression hid behind achievement. Anxiety lived behind politeness. So the lesson became different. Silence wasn't strength, it was risk. Unspoken pain didn't disappear, it accumulated. Here, safety came from articulation, from naming what was happening inside before it turned destructive, from learning language for feelings so they didn't leak sideways. So when someone said, "Talk about it," they weren't indulging emotion, they were preventing collapse. Again, not softness, strategy, two worlds, two survival logics. What makes this difficult is that neither group thinks they're following rules, but both are. In one world, there is an unspoken rule. If you can endure it, you should. In the other, there is a different rule. If you feel it deeply, you should examine it. So when these two people meet, the conflict isn't philosophical, it's neurological. One person experiences restraint as regulation. The other experiences restraint as suppression. One person experiences expression as destabilizing. The other experiences expression as stabilizing, and both are correct. In the environments that trained them, even success didn't mean the same thing. In many African settings, success was visible and shared. It meant reliability, provision, consistency, being the one others could lean on. Fulfillment was secondary. Personal satisfaction was private. You succeeded so others could breathe. In diaspora settings, success carried an internal dimension. It meant alignment, sustainability, not losing yourself to expectations, choosing a life that made sense to you. Burnout wasn't noble. Misalignment wasn't something to endure indefinitely. You succeeded so you could stay whole. So when one person says, "At least you're stable," and another says, "But I'm miserable," they are not disagreeing about facts. They are prioritizing different costs. Belonging to followed different rules. In communal environments, belonging often came from contribution. You were part of the group because you showed up, because you carried responsibility, because you didn't disrupt cohesion. In more individualistic environments, belonging often came from authenticity. You were accepted for being you, for naming your truth, for not shrinking to fit expectations. So when one person adjusts themselves to maintain peace, they feel responsible. And when another refuses to adjust themselves, they feel honest. Both are trying to belong. They're just using different currencies. This is why conversations between these worlds feel emotionally loaded even when no one is angry. Because underneath the words, there's fear. Fear of collapse, fear of loss, fear of becoming unsafe in different ways. When someone says, "Why do you need therapy for everything?" what they may really mean is, "I'm afraid that if we examine everything, nothing will hold." And when someone says, "Why won't you talk about this?" what they may really mean is, "I'm afraid that if we don't, I'll disappear inside myself." These aren't attacks, they're alarms. This is why people who love each other still clash. Parents and children, siblings, partners, friends, not because one side lacks depth, but because each side learned depth differently. One learned depth through endurance, the other learned depth through introspection. And when neither recognizes the other's training, every conversation feels slightly hostile, even when it isn't. This difference doesn't live in theory. It lives in moments people don't forget, even when nothing dramatic happens. It starts with something small. A young adult says, carefully, "I'm not sure I'm okay right now." They don't cry. They don't raise their voice. They're not asking for money. They're asking to be understood. The response comes back measured. You have food. You're educated. You're safe. What exactly is the problem? No anger, just confusion. The speaker feels exposed. The listener feels baffled, because to one person, safety means conditions, and to the other, safety means coherence. The conversation ends politely, but the distance remains. Later, the older person wonders why the younger one doesn't open up anymore. The younger one wonders why honesty always feels like inconvenience. No one says it out loud, but both feel misunderstood. Another scene. Two people are talking about a job. One says, "It's not fulfilling, but it pays well." The other asks, "Then why are you still there?" The answer comes immediately, "Because I can endure it." That sentence carries pride. Endurance meant survival once. Endurance meant dignity. Endurance meant you didn't fall apart when things were hard. But the listener hears something else. They hear exhaustion. They hear quiet resignation. They hear a future shrinking slowly. When they say, "But at what cost?" it sounds like judgment. And when the first person says, "Not everything is about happiness," it sounds like emotional neglect. Neither is wrong. They are solving different equations. One is minimizing risk. The other is minimizing regret. In relationships, the difference cuts even deeper. One partner shows love through reliability. They show up. They provide. They don't disappear under pressure. They believe consistency is affection. The other partner wants something harder to measure. Presence, emotional attunement, conversation that doesn't end in solutions. When they say, "I don't feel connected," it sounds ungrateful, because connection to the first partner is demonstrated through action, but to the second, connection is demonstrated through engagement. So one feels unappreciated, the other feels lonely. Both are giving sincerely. Both feel like something essential is missing. Even faith isn't immune. One person was taught that faith means obedience, endurance, and trust without constant questioning. You pray, you endure, you move forward. Another was taught that faith includes wrestling, questioning, and naming pain before God. You pray, you examine, you ask why. So when one person says, just trust God, they mean surrender. And when the other hears it, they hear dismissal of lived struggle. Same scripture, different formation. This is where it turns inward. You start policing yourself. You rehearse what you'll say before you say it. You decide which version of yourself is acceptable in which room. You become fluent in translation, not because you're fake, but because you're tired of being misunderstood. You wonder, am I too soft? Or was I just never allowed to be honest? Am I resilient? Or have I learned to disappear quietly? You feel loyalty pulling one way, self-trust pulling another, and no one tells you how to hold both without guilt. What makes this painful isn't disagreement, it's invalidation without intention. When your emotional reality isn't recognized as real, not rejected, just misunderstood, you start doubting yourself. And when your endurance isn't recognized as wisdom, not praised, just dismissed, you feel erased. This is why conversations escalate suddenly, because people aren't arguing about the present moment. They're defending the identity that kept them safe. Here's the shift most people never make. They assume these conflicts are about preference. They're not. They're about what the nervous system learned would keep life intact. One nervous system learned, if I endure, things don't fall apart. Another learned, if I speak, I don't disappear. So when one person stays silent, they're not avoiding, they're regulating. And when another person keeps talking, they're not spiraling, they're integrating. This is why telling someone to just toughen up doesn't work, and why telling someone to just open up doesn't land. Because you're asking them to abandon the strategy that once kept them safe. That's not a small ask. That's asking someone to risk instability, emotionally, relationally, or culturally. Here's the line people don't like to hear, but need to. What looks like emotional maturity in one context can look like emotional immaturity in another, and vice versa. Endurance without reflection can harden. Reflection without containment can destabilize. Both become problems when they turn into absolutes. And here's another truth that tends to go viral because it unsettles people. You can honor the culture that raised you and still outgrow the strategies it required. That's not betrayal, that's development. The real misunderstanding isn't between Africa and the diaspora. It's between survival identities and integration identities. Survival identities ask, how do we keep this going? Integration identities ask, how do we make sense of this? Survival identities are about continuity. Integration identities are about coherence. And many of us are living in the gap between the two. We're trying to be grateful and honest, strong and soft, rooted and self-aware. That tension isn't confusion, it's transition. When this difference isn't understood, people do one of two things. They harden or they disappear. They either double down on toughness or they shrink themselves to stay acceptable. But when this difference is understood, something subtle changes. You stop needing to prove your way is better. You stop needing permission to evolve. You stop personalizing every misunderstanding. You realize something important. Not everyone who raised you is equipped to validate who you're becoming. And that doesn't mean they failed you. It means they were formed for a different season. And here's another line that lingers. Gratitude for what saved you doesn't mean you owe it your future. That sentence alone will split comment sections because it touches the guilt many people carry but don't name. This is the part that matters most. Integration doesn't mean choosing one identity and rejecting the other. It means learning when each strategy is appropriate. There are moments when endurance is wisdom. There are moments when silence is strength. And there are moments when silence becomes self-erasure. Moments when endurance becomes avoidance. The work isn't choosing a side. The work is discernment. knowing when you're enduring because it's necessary, and when you're enduring because it's familiar, knowing when you're speaking because it brings clarity, and when you're speaking because you're dysregulated. That's maturity, not loudness, not toughness, discernment. So maybe the question isn't, why don't they understand me? Maybe it's, what did I learn was unsafe to express? What did I learn was unsafe to examine? What am I still protecting long after the danger passed? Some identities were built to survive instability. Others were built to survive fragmentation. And many of us are now living in a world that requires both. The challenge isn't choosing which identity is right. It's learning when to loosen one grip without losing the other. You're not weak for wanting language. You're not cold for valuing composure. You are responding to a world that shaped you, and now asking whether that shape still fits. That question doesn't demand an answer tonight. It's meant to follow you into conversations, into moments of tension, into the pauses where misunderstanding usually begins, quietly,